They considered it slow, outdated, and little more than a temporary solution. Yet in one terrifying day, this aircraft made the most powerful carrier force in the Pacific tremble. How could a small two-seat dive bomber break through fighters, anti-aircraft guns, and a solid wall of fire? Why did an aircraft expected to have a short service life become more dangerous than the machines designed to replace it? And what truly happened during those few minutes after which the direction of the war could no longer be reversed? Today, we are uncovering the story of the Douglas SBD Dauntless without the comfortable legends or polished heroics. You will see failed trials, disastrous command decisions, severe early losses, exaggerated combat reports, and engineering compromises that crews paid for at a terrible price. But the most unbelievable part began when this aircraft appeared above the Japanese carriers. Who led the dive bombers to their target almost by accident? Why did the enemy fail to stop the attack? And how did an aircraft slower than the fighters around it deliver a blow that changed the entire Pacific War? Stay with me and watch until the end. Ahead are facts rarely discussed, unexpected details from the decisive attacks, and the real reason a temporary aircraft became one of the most dangerous legends in naval aviation. But to understand why that aircraft appeared above the Japanese carriers, we have to return to the years between the two world wars. Aviation could already carry heavy bombs for hundreds of miles, yet bombing accuracy remained painfully poor. A formation could strike a warehouse, a railway station, or an urban district, hitting a single ship from high altitude while it changed course and speed was an entirely different problem. During level flight, a released bomb continued moving forward with the aircraft. Its fall was affected by altitude, airspeed, wind, the movement of the target, and even a small error in the timing of the release. In the seconds required for the bomb to reach the sea, a ship could move dozens of yards. The result was often an impressive column of water rising harmlessly beside the target. This mattered most in naval warfare, where one heavy bomb could disable a carrier, cruiser, or transport, but only if it struck the ship directly. The United States Navy began searching for a way to shorten the distance between the aircraft and its target during the final moments of aiming. The proposed solution appeared dangerous, almost reckless. Point the aircraft steeply downward and release the bomb during a dive instead of from steady level flight. The principle was straightforward. The aircraft climbed above the target, rolled into its descent, and attacked at a steep angle. The pilot could now see the ship directly ahead, hold it in the gun sight, and correct his path almost until the moment of release. The closer the dive bomber came, the less time the ship had to maneuver and the greater the chance of a hit. Accuracy, however, carried a price. Speed increased rapidly in the dive, the controls became heavier, and the pullout placed enormous strain on the wings, fuselage, and pilot. An error of only a few seconds could send the aircraft into the sea or tear it apart during recovery. The fleet therefore needed more than an ordinary bomber. It needed a strong carrier aircraft with precise controls, effective dive brakes, and a structure capable of surviving a violent pullout. This was the defining purpose of the new class of combat aircraft. A dive bomber was not designed to set speed records or carry out distant strategic raids. Its task was to approach a single moving target, pass through anti-aircraft fire, and place a bomb where a level bomber would almost certainly miss. The United States Navy was among the first services to pursue this idea consistently. By the middle of the 1920s, American naval aviators were already practicing attacks at steep angles, and early Curtiss dive-bombing aircraft later appeared aboard United States carriers. They demonstrated that a steep attack could improve accuracy, but they were still two-seat biplanes with open cockpits, external bracing, and limited performance. Aviation technology was advancing too quickly for them to remain useful for long. Speeds increased, bomb loads grew, ranges expanded, and carrier operations became more demanding. By the middle of the 1930s, the old biplanes were clearly unfit for the war that was approaching. The Navy needed a new all-metal aircraft that could not only dive toward an enemy ship, but also survive the attack and return to its carrier. In 1934, the United States Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics announced a competition for a new carrier-based scout bomber. The requirements were severe. The aircraft had to take off from a short deck, land on a moving ship, withstand a steep dive, and survive a violent pullout close to the water. On paper, the Navy was seeking a new generation machine, but in practice, it had not yet decided exactly what that aircraft should be. Several American companies answered the call. Northrop, Brewster, Great Lakes, Vought, and other manufacturers prepared designs. Some offered all-metal monoplanes, while others continued to rely on the familiar biplane layout. Engineers argued over wing strength, cockpit visibility, bomb placement, and the aircraft's behavior during a carrier landing. This was a period when military aviation was changing faster than official specifications could be rewritten. One day, the biplane still appeared to be a reliable and proven solution. Soon afterward, its bracing wires, open cockpit, and heavy aerodynamic drag belonged to a disappearing age. The Navy found itself caught between two generations and began making decisions that would quickly have to be reversed. Before the competition had even reached a proper conclusion, influential supporters of Curtiss pushed another carrier biplane into service. The aircraft received official approval before its principal rivals had completed their full trials. Naval leaders selected a familiar design because it appeared less risky, but that caution soon created an even larger problem. Believe it or not, the Navy then returned to several projects it had already pushed aside. After further modifications, more than one experimental aircraft was approved for limited production. The batches were small, ranging from roughly 30 to 60 machines, but that was enough to test them not in polished reports, but in daily carrier service. This was the most unforgiving stage of any naval aircraft program, operation aboard an aircraft carrier. It was not enough to make one impressive takeoff in front of an evaluation board. The machine had to land repeatedly on a rolling deck, endure salt air, hard impacts on the landing gear, cramped hangars, hurried maintenance, and the mistakes of inexperienced pilots. That was where the hidden defects began to appear. Some aircraft were too heavy, others responded poorly to the controls, and several suffered from weak landing gear or dangerous behavior during recovery from a dive. At a test airfield, such failures could still be dismissed as isolated incidents. Aboard a carrier, they became a constant threat to the crew and to the ship itself. In the end, the Navy received several new dive bombers, but none fully answered the original requirement. A bureaucratic compromise produced an entire family of transitional aircraft, each solving only part of the problem. The engineers had to return to their drawing boards, and from that chain of mistakes would soon emerge another aircraft initially regarded as temporary, the future SBD Dauntless. In 1938, Northrop's El Segundo plant and its naval contracts passed under Douglas control. The facilities were accompanied by a group of engineers led by Ed Heinemann. Waiting on their drawing boards was a project that had already given the Navy far too many unpleasant surprises: the carrier-based BT-1 dive bomber. The aircraft looked modern, with an all-metal fuselage, a low-mounted wing, an enclosed cockpit, and perforated dive brakes. In the air, however, that clean design revealed a dangerous temper. It was underpowered, became nervous at low speed, held its direction poorly, and could suddenly drop into a difficult roll. This was not a collection of minor faults that could be cured by replacing a single instrument. On an aircraft carrier, instability forced the pilot to fight his own machine during the most dangerous seconds of the mission, the landing approach and the recovery from a dive. The final BT-1 was therefore turned into the heavily redesigned XBT-2 instead of receiving another superficial modification. The prototype received a Wright engine producing about 1,000 horsepower, replacing the earlier unit of roughly 825 horsepower. The landing gear became fully retractable, the rudder was modified, and several structural elements were changed. Speed improved, but additional power alone did not solve the problem. The aircraft still demanded excessive care and punished abrupt control movements. The XBT-2 was then sent to Langley and placed inside the enormous full-scale wind tunnel operated by the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. Engineers tested almost the entire aircraft rather than a small model, measuring drag, stability, and control response. This work made it possible to identify precisely what a pilot could feel through the control stick, but could not always explain after a flight. This was the turning point of the entire program. Before Langley, the designers had mostly been correcting symptoms, guided by pilots' complaints and isolated flight tests. They now had a systematic picture and could alter the aircraft with a clearer understanding of which airflow produced yaw, roll, or a loss of control. The engineering team progressively revised the tail surfaces, rudder, ailerons, external contours, and landing gear mechanism. Every change was tested again in the air, at low speed, during abrupt maneuvers, in a steep descent, and through a high-load pullout. Step by step, the prototype stopped behaving like a temperamental machine that could punish a pilot for a small mistake. By the end of the main trials, the XBT-2 was already markedly different from the original BT-1. It was more stable, more predictable through the controls, and safer during landing, while its dangerous tendency to drop sharply into a roll had largely been eliminated. After Douglas took over the project, the aircraft received a new designation, SBD-1, the prototype of the future Dauntless, born not from one brilliant first drawing, but from a long and unforgiving campaign of correcting mistakes. It was on this redesigned aircraft that the feature later identified most closely with the Dauntless appeared. Large metal panels, pierced by rows of circular holes, ran along the trailing edge of the wing. They attracted little attention in normal flight, but during an attack they opened and completely changed the behavior of the machine. When the pilot rolled into a dive, the panels spread apart and created powerful resistance against the airflow. The Dauntless lowered its nose and descended at angles of up to 70 degrees, and in some attacks close to 80, without accelerating beyond control. The perforations allowed part of the airflow to pass through and reduce the violent tail buffeting that could ruin the pilot's aim or throw the aircraft off its line. This concerned the final seconds, when the horizon had already disappeared from the pilot's view. The carrier deck expanded across the windscreen, air hammered the wings, and anti-aircraft tracers passed around the aircraft. The machine still answered the controls, allowing the pilot to hold the target in the sight almost until the moment of release. Without the dive brakes, speed would have increased too rapidly during a steep descent. The pilot would have been forced to release the bomb earlier and from a greater altitude, then recover under an even more violent load. The Dauntless could move closer, correct its direction, and drop the bomb when the ship already filled almost the entire field of view. The hardest stage began after release. The pilot closed the brakes, applied engine power, and pulled back on the control stick, forcing the aircraft from an almost vertical fall into level flight. Its strong structure absorbed the brutal recovery, while predictable handling offered a chance to escape just above the water, where the cost of hesitation was measured not in minutes but in fractions of a second. This was the central combat quality of the SBD. It was no record-breaking aircraft, but it allowed crews to repeat an extremely difficult attack while retaining control where a faster but less obedient machine might drift away from the aiming line. The accuracy of the Dauntless came not from one clever device, but from the combination of its perforated brakes, strong wing, and predictable response to the controls. It was still far from a perfect carrier aircraft. To reduce weight, the designers omitted a wing-folding mechanism, so the Dauntless occupied nearly its full span inside the hangar. On a carrier, where every yard of deck and every open corner mattered, this seriously restricted the number of aircraft that could be carried. Its speed was not impressive either. Early Dauntless variants reached roughly 400 kilometers per hour and were only slightly faster than several older carrier aircraft. But the SBD was not built to win a race. Its real weapons were strength, control, and the ability to place a heavy bomb into the deck of a ship that had believed itself unreachable only seconds earlier. The first production SBD-1s entered service as true two-seat scout bombers. Two fixed Browning machine guns of 50 caliber were mounted above the engine and fired by the pilot. The rear hemisphere was protected by the radio operator, who handled a single flexible rifle-caliber machine gun. For a carrier aircraft, that combination mattered. The pilot could fire at a target while pulling out of an attack or meet an enemy fighter head-on, while the second crewman watched the rear and maintained radio contact. Yet one magazine-fed gun provided only short bursts, and its field of fire was restricted by the tail and cockpit. This applied to the early SBD-1, which was still designed as a compromise between a scout aircraft and a dive bomber. It had to locate enemy ships, report their position, and attack them itself if necessary. That was why it combined radio equipment, an observer's position, defensive armament, and a useful bomb load. The Dauntless had 3 bomb stations. A small bomb could be carried under each wing, while the main weapon, weighing about 450 kilograms, was suspended beneath the fuselage. The total load of the early aircraft approached 800 kilograms, but the central bomb remained the decisive weapon. Simply hanging it under the belly was not enough. During a nearly vertical dive, a freely released bomb could strike the propeller turning in front of the fuselage. The engineers therefore created a hinged launching fork, commonly called a bomb crutch, which swung the weapon forward and downward, clear of the propeller arc. This was not a decorative technical detail. It was essential to the entire attack. Without the crutch, the aircraft could not safely release a heavy bomb at a steep angle. With it, the Dauntless preserved the main advantage of dive bombing, closing on the ship, holding it in the sight, and releasing the weapon almost along the aircraft's own flight path. The first production aircraft still failed to satisfy the Navy. Their practical range was too limited for ocean operations, where a carrier had to locate the enemy before the opposing force could launch its own strike. A calculated range of roughly 1,500 kilometers looked acceptable on paper, but the real combat radius was reduced by bomb load, wind, maneuvering, and the fuel reserve required for the return flight. The SBD-1s were therefore assigned mainly to United States Marine Corps squadrons. The Navy demanded more fuel and an aircraft better suited to long reconnaissance missions over open water. The designers modified the machine once again without changing its basic configuration. The result was the SBD-2. It received additional fuel capacity, greater range, and an autopilot that reduced crew fatigue during long searches over the sea. In this form, the Dauntless began reaching the decks of American aircraft carriers only months before the Pacific became the main theater of a new war. On the 7th of December, 1941, war reached the Dauntless without warning. Japanese aircraft were already moving over Oahu, while the carrier Enterprise was returning to Hawaii after delivering fighters to Wake Island. At 6:20 that morning, 18 SBD-2s took off from her deck in 9 two-aircraft sections, ordered to search the ocean ahead of the ship and then land at Ford Island. The pilots did not yet know that they were flying directly into the center of the Japanese attack. When smoke, flashes, and a sky crowded with aircraft appeared ahead, a routine search instantly became their first real battle. Instead of a quiet arrival, the crews found burning ships, attacking fighters, and airfields still being swept by Japanese machine gun fire. This concerned a few confused minutes when no one yet understood the full situation. Radio channels were filled with broken messages. Anti-aircraft crews fired at almost anything appearing over the harbor, and every pilot had only seconds to identify the enemy and choose a place to land. The Dauntless, designed for organized searches over the ocean and carefully aimed attacks on ships, had entered a chaotic air battle. Japanese fighters quickly fell upon the scattered two-seat aircraft. The SBDs tried to escape in dives, answered with their forward Brownings, and their radio operators swung the single rear gun toward the attackers. Dauntless crews claimed 2 Japanese aircraft, but the cost of their first encounter was far greater. 7 of the 18 SBDs were lost in the air or wrecked during forced landings. The situation on the ground was no better. Nearly every Marine Corps SBD-1 parked at Iwa Airfield was destroyed or heavily damaged before it could take off. Within 25 minutes, 9 of the 20 aircraft were completely knocked out, 10 required major repair, and only 1 escaped with comparatively light damage. This was the first unforgiving lesson of the new war. On a drawing board, the SBD-2 looked like a strong all-metal aircraft, but its crew had almost no protection against bullets and fragments. Its wings contained ordinary fuel tanks that could rapidly leak or ignite after being pierced, while only 1 rifle-caliber machine gun stood between the rear gunner and an attacking fighter. The rear sector was especially vulnerable. The gunner had to watch the sky, replace magazines, maintain communications, and fire from a cramped cockpit while an enemy fighter approached at higher speed. A single burst could damage the engine, sever a control line, or puncture a tank, and even a skilled pilot might then be unable to bring the aircraft back. Pearl Harbor destroyed the comfortable belief that predictable handling and a strong wing were enough for combat. The SBD-2 could fly long distances, dive accurately, and carry a heavy bomb, but its protection still belonged to peacetime. The Navy now needed a Dauntless that could not only hit its target, but also bring both crewmen home after facing anti-aircraft fire and Japanese fighters. Even before the United States entered the war, Douglas was preparing a new version of the Dauntless for a foreign customer. French naval aviation had ordered 174 aircraft, but after the defeat of France in 1940, the batch remained in the United States. The Navy gained an opportunity not only to expand the order, but also to demand an aircraft prepared for real combat rather than peacetime exercises. The central lesson was obvious. Range and accuracy meant little if the aircraft caught fire after one well-placed burst. The new SBD-3 received self-sealing fuel tanks, armor protection for the pilot and radio operator, and an armored windscreen. A bullet or fragment no longer had to cause an immediate fuel loss, fire, and loss of control. This concerned one of the most dangerous parts of the aircraft, the tanks inside the wings. In an ordinary tank, a puncture remained open and gasoline poured into the wing or sprayed into the airflow. The self-sealing lining swelled when it came into contact with fuel and partly closed the hole, reducing the leak and giving the crew additional time. The men also needed protection. The pilot sat forward beside the engine and fuel system, while the gunner occupied a higher position farther aft and was heavily exposed to attacks from behind. Armor plates did not turn the Dauntless into a flying tank, but they could stop fragments and some bullets that had previously passed through the thin metal skin almost without resistance. This was not about crew comfort. It was about completing the mission. The dive bomber had to pass through shipboard anti-aircraft fire, release its bomb, pull out near the water, and then survive an encounter with Japanese fighters. An aircraft that struck its target but could not return to the carrier quickly lost its value to the entire squadron. Early SBD-3s still protected the rear hemisphere with a single rifle-caliber machine gun. Combat soon showed that its volume of fire was inadequate against fast-attacking fighters. After the Battle of the Coral Sea, a twin mount carrying 230 caliber machine guns began to appear in the rear cockpit, while aircraft already in service were modified in the field. Every improvement carried a price. The new tanks, armor plates, armored windscreen, and heavier defensive armament increased the aircraft's weight, while maximum speed fell slightly to about 250 miles per hour. Aviators even gave the variant the ironic nickname the Speedy 3 because no one expected it to win a race. This was the central engineering compromise of wartime. The aircraft could have remained lighter and gained a few additional miles per hour, but that difference meant almost nothing against a faster fighter. A protected tank, armor behind the crew, and a second machine gun could instead provide the few seconds needed to escape a violent aerial fight and reach the carrier. Pilots accepted the additional weight without enthusiasm, but also without serious objection. Ahead lay raids against island bases, searches for enemy ships, and the first major clashes between carrier forces. Those battles would prove that the Dauntless did not need to win a race in the sky. It needed to absorb punishment, remain under control, and return to the deck after releasing its bomb. In the spring of 1942, Japan was preparing another offensive in the southern Pacific. The objective of Operation MO was Port Moresby on the southern coast of New Guinea. Capturing that base would threaten the sea routes between the United States and Australia and bring Japanese air power closer to the northeastern regions of the Australian continent. On the 3rd of May, Japanese troops occupied Tulagi in the southern Solomon Islands without serious resistance. They intended to establish a seaplane base there, capable of watching a vast area of ocean and supporting the next stage of the advance. After receiving news of the landing, Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher turned the carrier Yorktown north and decided to strike without waiting to join Lexington. This marked the opening of the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first major naval engagement in which the opposing ships never came within sight of one another. Carrier aircraft became the main weapon on both sides. Before stopping the Japanese advance, the Americans first had to discover what forces were gathered at Tulagi and how strongly they were protected. On the morning of the 4th of May, Yorktown launched its first strike group, 28 SBD Dauntless dive bombers and 12 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers. They found the Japanese ships anchored with almost no fighter protection. The Dauntlesses dived one after another, the torpedo bombers approached close to the water, and the surprised vessels began raising anchor and trying to escape the harbor. 2 more attacks followed the first. American aircraft dropped heavy bombs, launched torpedoes, and strafed small vessels and seaplanes. During the day, Yorktown lost 1 torpedo bomber and 2 fighters after they became lost and exhausted their fuel, while several Dauntlesses returned with damage. This was the point at which the first combat reports began turning a local raid into the supposed destruction of an entire Japanese squadron. Returning crews reported destroyers, gunboats, and transports sunk. A Coast Watcher's message then claimed that 9 ships had gone down, including 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and 3 transports. Impressive, is it not? Especially when the American aircraft had attacked a relatively small force gathered beside an island. Headquarters could already picture an overwhelming victory, the harbor devastated, major warships destroyed, and the Japanese offensive crippled before it approached Port Moresby. Japanese records examined after the war revealed a very different result. The destroyer Kikuzuki, 2 special minesweepers, and the auxiliary minesweeper Tamamaru were lost at Tulagi, while several other vessels were damaged. 3 cruisers and 3 transports had not been destroyed. The error did not necessarily begin with a deliberate attempt to invent victories. A pilot saw an explosion, smoke, and a ship disappearing behind a column of water, then had only seconds to pull out under fire. Different formations could attack the same damaged vessel and record it separately as several targets. The Dauntless had achieved a real success, but one far more modest than the first triumphant reports suggested. On the 7th of May, 1942, American scouts reported 2 Japanese carriers and 4 heavy cruisers north of Mishima Island. Strike groups immediately began taking off from Lexington and Yorktown. Only after the aircraft were airborne did the commanders discover that the pilot had actually seen cruisers and that an error on his code pad had turned the contact report into a message about carriers. It was too late to recall 92 aircraft. At almost the same moment, Australian reconnaissance supplied new coordinates. A real carrier and its escorts were operating in the same general area. The American groups changed course and at about 11:30 found the light carrier Shoho. This was the first massed Dauntless attack against an aircraft carrier. Lexington sent 28 SBDs, 12 torpedo bombers, and 10 fighters, while Yorktown launched 24 SBDs, 10 torpedo bombers, and 8 fighters. Nearly all the available striking power of 2 American carriers was moving against one comparatively small ship. Lexington's aircraft reached the target first. The dive bombers circled above the formation, opened their perforated brakes, and rolled over one after another. The narrow flight deck expanded rapidly inside the site. Anti-aircraft bursts filled the air, and the speed climbed toward 300 miles per hour. The pilot held the ship in the center of the site until the final seconds, released the heavy bomb, and immediately pulled back on the control stick. The Dauntless sagged under the crushing load, passed close above the sea, and cleared the way for the next aircraft. Torpedo bombers then came in at low altitude, forcing the Japanese carrier to evade bombs from above and torpedoes running across the surface. This was the moment when the sheer number of attackers overwhelmed the ship's defense. By the time Yorktown's group arrived, Shoho was already burning and listing heavily. 24 Dauntlesses began their dives from roughly 18,000 feet, each carrying a 1,000-pound bomb. The flight deck disappeared beneath smoke, fresh explosions tore through the hull, and torpedoes struck below the waterline. Within minutes of the end of the attack, Shoho rolled over and vanished beneath the sea. A brief radio message followed. "Scratch one flat top." She was the first Japanese aircraft carrier lost in the Pacific War. There was still no time to celebrate. On the 8th of May, scouts from both sides located the opposing main carrier forces almost simultaneously. American aircraft reached Shokaku and Zuikaku in broken cloud and rain squalls. Zuikaku escaped beneath the weather, while Shokaku remained exposed. This was now a true carrier duel. 24 SBDs from Yorktown approached at about 17,000 feet and began a coordinated attack with the torpedo bombers. Several heavy bombs smashed through Shokaku's flight deck, started fires, and prevented the carrier from operating aircraft normally. At almost the same time, the Japanese strike group appeared over the American formation. Yorktown avoided the torpedoes, but received a direct bomb hit. Lexington was in far greater trouble. 2 torpedoes struck her port side, followed by several bomb hits. At first, the carrier appeared to have survived. She maintained speed, the list was reduced, and the main fires seemed to be under control. Aviation gasoline vapors, however, were collecting inside the hull, and a powerful internal explosion soon ripped through the compartments, after which the spreading fire could no longer be contained. Lexington had to be abandoned, and that evening, an American destroyer finished the burning carrier with torpedoes. The first great carrier battle therefore ended not in a one-sided triumph, but in a brutal exchange of blows. The Dauntless sent Shoho to the bottom and put Shokaku out of action, but the United States Navy paid for that success with one of its largest carriers. On the 8th of May, 1942, as the Japanese strike group approached Lexington and Yorktown, the Americans did not have enough fighters to cover every altitude. Some SBD Dauntlesses had to be used in an unfamiliar role as a low-level anti-torpedo patrol. Dive bombers built to attack ships turned toward the incoming Japanese aircraft and entered an air battle. According to Lexington's action report, the Dauntless patrol was credited with 9 torpedo bombers and 2 fighters, while 1 SBD was lost to enemy action. Those figures represented American combat claims and did not always match confirmed Japanese losses. The essential point, however, was beyond dispute. A relatively slow bomber had helped disrupt an attack by aircraft approaching almost at sea level. This concerned qualities that did not appear in a simple table of maximum speeds. The Dauntless had a strong structure, remained stable at low altitude, and retained control during abrupt maneuvers. Where a heavier or less predictable machine might stall, the SBD allowed its pilot to turn toward the attacker, accept a head-on pass, and fire the two heavy Browning machine guns in the nose. It could not, of course, match the Mitsubishi A6M0 in an ordinary pursuit. The Japanese fighter was faster, climbed better, and held a major advantage in a prolonged turning fight. A Dauntless crew therefore could not fight by the enemy's rules. Survival depended not on outrunning or outturning the Zero, but on one short, decisive maneuver, the strength of the airframe, and the coordination of two crewmen. When a fighter approached from behind, the radio gunner warned the pilot and met the attack with the twin rear guns. The pilot could push the nose down, using the SBD's ability to gather speed in a dive or brake into a hard turn. When a sudden reduction of speed was needed, he could deploy the perforated dive brakes, the same mechanism normally used to stabilize the aircraft while aiming at a ship. This could create an unpleasant surprise for the pursuer. The fighter expected the heavy bomber to continue forward at the same speed, but the Dauntless could slow sharply and alter its direction. An attacker risked passing ahead and spending several seconds inside the field of fire of the forward guns. Mutual protection was just as important. Crews tried to remain close enough for the gunners of neighboring aircraft to cover one another's rear sectors. A Japanese pilot was then attacking not one unprotected tail, but a formation from which several flexible gun mounts could answer at once. None of this turned the SBD into a fighter or removed its vulnerabilities. If it lost speed, became separated from the formation, or was surprised from above, the Zero retained an overwhelming advantage. A lone Dauntless could resist, but its best chance came from detecting the threat early, protecting neighboring crews, and immediately using the maneuvers for which the aircraft was genuinely suited. Under official American wartime credits, Dauntless pilots and gunners claimed 138 victories in aerial combat, with a substantial share credited to the men in the rear cockpit. Like most air combat statistics, that total included overclaiming and did not equal the exact number of confirmed Japanese losses. Even so, it destroyed the central myth. The SBD was a slow bomber, but it was never a helpless target. On the 4th of June, 1942, the first aircraft to reach the Japanese carriers did not come from an American flight deck, but from Midway itself. 16 SBD-2s of VMSB 241 took off under Major Lofton Henderson, followed by 11 aging SB-2U Vindicators. Their order was direct: find the carriers and attack them at any cost. At about 8 in the morning, the Marine aviators sighted the Japanese formation. The squadron, however, had received its Dauntlesses only recently, and many pilots had not mastered the near-vertical attack. Instead of making a precise dive, they entered shallower descents and remained exposed longer to shipboard anti-aircraft fire and Zero fighters. This was the attack on Hiryu, and it became a disaster. Japanese fighters broke into the formation during the approach. Henderson's aircraft went out of control and disappeared below, and the remaining crews continued without proper protection. Not one bomb achieved a confirmed direct hit on the carrier. Only 8 of the 16 Dauntlesses returned to Midway. Almost every surviving aircraft required major repair. Lieutenant Daniel Iverson's SBD-2 came back with its hydraulic system destroyed, one wing damaged, and more than 200 bullet and fragment holes. He had to land with one landing gear leg still retracted. Who could have imagined after that attack that the same type of aircraft would deliver Japan's heaviest blow of the war only a few hours later? While mechanics examined the riddled Marine aircraft, carrier squadrons from Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown were already approaching from the northeast. Their attack, however, also began to fall apart. TBD Devastator torpedo bombers reached the Japanese carriers in separate groups, without coordinated fighter cover and at very low altitude. Zeros and shipboard guns nearly destroyed all three squadrons without allowing them to score a single confirmed hit. Yet the Japanese fighters had been pulled down to sea level, had expended ammunition, and briefly lost the altitude needed to intercept the dive bombers. This was the moment when defeat suddenly began to turn into opportunity. 33 Dauntlesses from Enterprise, led by Clarence Wade McCluskey, reached the calculated position and found nothing. The Japanese ships had changed course, American fuel was running low, and returning without an attack would mean failure for the entire operation. McCluskey chose to continue the search. Below, he noticed the lone Japanese destroyer Arashi racing back toward the formation after attacking the American submarine Nautilus. He followed the destroyer's wake, and before long, 4 aircraft carriers appeared ahead. At almost the same time, 17 SBDs from Yorktown under Maxwell Leslie approached from another direction. Neither group knew the other was close. At about 10:22, however, both arrived above the Japanese fleet at the same moment. This concerned the 3 minutes that decided the battle. Yorktown's aircraft went after Soryu. Most of the Enterprise group descended on Kaga, while McCluskey and several aircraft shifted toward Akagi after seeing that the flagship had been left almost untouched. The Dauntlesses rolled over, opened their perforated brakes, and dropped from more than 13,000 feet. Flight decks filled the sights, crowded with fueled and armed aircraft, while fuel and prepared ordnance waited inside the ships. Pilots released their bombs in the final seconds and pulled out almost over the masts and the sea. Kaga received a series of heavy hits and was rapidly hidden by fire. Bombs smashed through Soryu's deck and triggered explosions inside the hangar. Akagi was struck fewer times, but one accurately placed bomb was enough to ignite prepared aircraft and leave the flagship beyond control. This was the scene with which the story began. 3 Japanese carriers became burning wrecks almost simultaneously within roughly 3 minutes. Hiryu remained untouched and launched 2 counterstrikes against Yorktown, but later that afternoon, Dauntlesses from Enterprise, including surviving Yorktown crews, found Nagumo's last operational carrier. At about 5 in the afternoon, the American dive bombers attacked again. Several heavy bombs tore open Hiryu's flight deck and started fires that the crew could no longer contain. In a single day, the 4 carriers forming the striking core of the Japanese fleet were put out of action by aircraft whose Marine crews had returned to Midway that morning in riddled and broken machines. The Dauntless therefore connected 2 opposite episodes of the same battle. In the hands of an inexperienced and poorly protected group, it suffered terrible losses and achieved nothing. But when the aircraft's accuracy met determined commanders, an enemy mistake, and one brief moment of opportunity, the small and relatively slow dive bomber changed the course of the Pacific War. Midway did not mark the end of the Dauntless story. On the 7th of August, 1942, American forces landed on Guadalcanal and Tulagi, beginning the first major Allied offensive in the Pacific. Their central objective was an unfinished Japanese airfield, later named Henderson Field. Holding it meant preventing Japanese ships and aircraft from cutting the route between the United States and Australia. On the 20th of August, 12 SBD-3s of VMSB 232 arrived at the rain-damaged strip. Together with Wildcat fighters, they formed the core of the so-called Cactus Air Force, a mixed aviation group operating from Guadalcanal. Mechanics worked under bombardment, filled tanks from fuel drums, and loaded bombs on parking areas covered with mud. This concerned a very different war from an orderly carrier operation. Dauntlesses took off from a damaged runway, supported the Marines, and struck storage areas, artillery positions, barges, and ships, trying to deliver reinforcements at night. The same aircraft might attack a position in the jungle during the morning and search for a Japanese convoy over the sea that evening. On the 24th of August, the Battle of the Eastern Solomons began. Carrier-based SBDs and torpedo bombers found the light carrier Ryujo and struck her with bombs and torpedoes, eventually forcing the crew to abandon the ship. At the same time, Dauntlesses from Enterprise flew reconnaissance, guarded the formation, and reported the location of Japanese forces. 2 months later, on the 26th of October, the aircraft met again near the Santa Cruz Islands. American dive bombers damaged the carriers Shokaku and Zuiho and attacked ships in their escort. The Japanese response was equally severe. Hornet was lost, Enterprise was damaged, and she became the only American carrier still capable of operating in the area. This concerned the defining character of the Guadalcanal campaign. Victory did not depend on one spectacular raid. Aircraft, ships, and ground forces exchanged blows for months, while every fuel drum delivered, every machine repaired, and every flight from Henderson Field gradually wore down the Japanese offensive. The 14th of November was particularly violent. A Japanese convoy was carrying thousands of troops and a huge load of ammunition, food, and equipment toward Guadalcanal. Throughout the day, SBDs from Henderson Field and Enterprise, working with torpedo aircraft and heavy bombers, repeatedly attacked the transports. 9 ships were hit, 7 were lost, and the attempt to deliver a major reinforcement was largely destroyed. By then, the Dauntless had earned a reputation as the principal anti-ship weapon of American carrier aviation. An almost identical machine, however, also served with the Army under the designation a 24 Banshee. It lacked the arresting hook used for carrier landings, but retained the basic structure, engine, and armament of the naval SBD. This concerned the difference between a good aircraft and a properly organized system for using it. Naval crews trained to find ships, dive in formation, protect one another, and operate with fighter support. Army A-24s entered the Southwest Pacific amid haste, missing spare parts, weak protection, and a badly disrupted supply system. 52 aircraft sent toward the Philippines had to be diverted to Australia. They arrived worn, with problems affecting their guns and landing gear, and some were later sent to Java without armor or self-sealing tanks. Of the 15 A-24s that reached the island in February, only 7 could be made ready for the first combat missions. During the summer, disaster followed in New Guinea. On the 26th of July, 7 A-24s attacked a Japanese convoy off Buna without adequate fighter protection. 5 were shot down, another was damaged too badly to return, and only 1 aircraft survived the mission. The failure of the Banshee did not prove that the design itself had suddenly become useless. Army units sent the aircraft out in small groups, with poorly organized escort, worn engines, and inadequate protection against strong fighters and distant targets. The same machine became a precise weapon inside the Navy's complete combat system, while in Army service it was too often left alone with a mission that the strength of its wings could not solve. The Dauntless continued to roll off the production line even after its successor existed on drawing boards and had entered testing. The Navy intended to replace the SBD before the United States entered the war, but the new Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver proved more complicated, heavier, and far more difficult to perfect. While Curtiss engineers struggled with its faults, the old temporary aircraft remained where it was needed most, in combat squadrons. The SBD-4 appeared late in 1942. It received a new 24-volt electrical system and a Hamilton standard propeller with hydraulic pitch control. The more powerful electrical system allowed search radar equipment to be installed, although radar was not carried by every aircraft. This concerned an important change in the Dauntless mission. Previously, crews searched for ships almost entirely with their eyes, spending hours watching the horizon and the gaps between clouds. A radar-equipped aircraft could now locate large targets in poor weather or above dark water, expanding its usefulness for reconnaissance and anti-submarine patrols. The SBD-5 began reaching squadrons early in 1943 and became the most numerous version of the family. Its 1,200 horsepower Wright engine was intended to recover some of the performance lost to armor, extra fuel, and additional equipment. The early telescopic sight gave way to a more practical reflector sight, while a heated windscreen reduced the fogging that had interfered with dives from high altitude. Its carrying options also expanded. The Dauntless could take a heavy centerline bomb, smaller weapons beneath the wings, and jettisonable fuel tanks for longer flights. On some aircraft, radar made it possible to search for ships and submarines in conditions where ordinary observation was no longer effective. This was not the creation of an entirely new aircraft, but the steady extraction of more capability from a familiar design. Every instrument added weight, every tank reduced acceleration, and the stronger engine only partly compensated for the burden. The Dauntless became more useful, but it never became fast. The final production version was the SBD-6, powered by a 1,350 horsepower engine. Its top speed rose to about 262 miles per hour, but by the time it appeared, the Helldiver was already taking its place aboard carriers. Only 450 SBD-6 were built, and most remained in training or rear area units. The replacement was not welcomed by everyone. The Helldiver carried a heavier load and had folding wings, but early aircraft suffered from numerous technical problems, required more maintenance, and responded less cleanly to the controls. Many pilots preferred the old Dauntless for its predictable handling, reliability, and willingness to forgive mistakes that the newer aircraft punished too quickly. This was the great paradox of the SBD career. It had been considered outdated before the war began and was repeatedly scheduled to leave the front line, yet it continued flying combat missions. The last offensive operation by Navy Dauntlesses came during the summer of 1944 in a strike against Guam, while Marine aircraft continued serving in the Philippines and against isolated Japanese garrisons. On the 21st of July, 1944, the Douglas plant at El Segundo completed the last Dauntless. Total production reached 5,936 aircraft across the Navy and Army versions. For a machine conceived as a transitional solution, it was a figure that neither its sponsors nor its earliest test pilots could have predicted. The true legacy of the Dauntless, however, was not measured in tons of metal. Its crews destroyed the core of the Japanese carrier force at Midway and fought in the Coral Sea, over Guadalcanal, throughout the Solomons, and in the Atlantic. The pilot held the target in the sight, the gunner guarded the tail, and between them worked an aircraft that won not through speed, but through accuracy, strength, and the confidence of its crew. A sharp saying circulated among carrier aviators: "Fighter pilots make movies, but bomber pilots make history." There was plenty of pride in those words, but for Dauntless crews, they sounded deserved. Those men did not merely witness the turning of the war, they entered the dive and shaped it with their own hands. After the war, the idea of a specialized dive bomber began to disappear rapidly. Faster and more versatile attack aircraft could deliver bombs, rockets, radar-directed attacks, and later guided weapons without dropping almost vertically toward the target. The dangerous maneuver that had once required special wings, perforated brakes, and bomb crutches gradually became unnecessary. That ended not only the story of one aircraft, but also the story of an entire class of combat machines. The Dauntless entered the war as a slow, temporary dive bomber and left it as the aircraft that appeared at the right place on the decisive day and changed the fate of the Pacific. If you found this story worthwhile, support the channel, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe. Thank you for watching. Peace to everyone, and until next time. If you enjoyed this story, please leave a like. It will help the video reach new viewers. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you do not miss our upcoming episodes about legendary aircraft, forgotten projects, and aerial battles that changed the course of history. Tell us in the comments which combat aircraft we should cover next. Thank you for watching. Peace to everyone, and until next time.